Hi there, this is Xiao Pierre Ruth for Information Week, and today we're going to be taking a look at the question of how CIOs can prepare their successors. Essentially, where do little CIOs come from? Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Zastrocky, Executive Director of the Leadership Board for CIOs in Higher Education. Michael, thank you so much for making yourself available and being here.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to be here, JP.
Gotcha. Great. All right, so let's just kind of like get at the essential elements of this. Where do we look for future CIOs? Where do they come from? Are they typically elevated from within an organization's ranks? I, I'm sure it's easy. Well, maybe not so much easy, but looking to other organizations to bring on a CIO, but to actually bring in the future, the next generations of CIOs. Where does that really start? Where does kind of like that initial kind of like effort
But
tend to
it's
look?
changed. It's changed today from when I came into the field. I came from an academic position. I was a professor and a dean and became a chief information officer, but it wasn't a title called chief information officer at that point in time 40 years ago. And of course, it evolved. And the first generation of people who acquired the title of CIOs came from all sorts of background, some from academics, some from administrative. It wasn't necessarily a technical background. So you found people with backgrounds that came from the liberal arts area, from the humanities, as well as the hard sciences coming into that particular role. And we were doing a job that was unique in the sense that it was the first time anyone had taken on that role to try to look at the management of technology across the institution. So that first generation was, in a sense, blessed with the ability to look at higher ed intimately from the role that technology was going to play. So we got into analyzing and looking at how technology could interface with everything from fundraising to all of the financial systems to the academic systems to just basically running the university. So we learned an awful lot about higher education as the first generation of CIOs. From that point on, though, then we decided as a group that we needed to begin to prepare the next generation of leaders for technology. And at the time, I was a vice president of what is today EDUCAUSE. We started the leadership program at CAUSE to begin to train next generation of leaders of technology. So that was one route that we took to begin that process. And to be very candid, in the mid 80s, we had a lengthy discussion amongst ourselves as a board of CAUSE on whether or not managing technology was a profession and should we have professional development activities, because it was such a new field. Some people thought, well, it's just here for a particular period of time, and once things settle out, then you won't need to worry about it. And most of us thought, no, this is here for a long haul and it's going to evolve, but it is a profession and we need to do professional development activities. And of course, that began a lot of professional development activities for CIOs. So that was the first phase.
Mhm.
In that process, though, one of the things that I was very fortunate to have was a lot of people who took time to mentor me and to build my skills within the profession by teaching me what they knew, and vice versa. It was a relationship that was easy to acquire in those days because you would go to a conference such as EDUCOM or CAUSE or CUMREC or any of those technology leadership conferences, and the number of people attendant were less than 1,000. You could sit in one hotel and wait for people to come by and sit down over a cup of coffee and ask questions and learn. As those organizations grew, though, that became less likely, and you had to really search out people to get information from. But that's an important piece of learning and growing the profession. And it's one of the things that when we started the leadership board for CIOs 15 years ago, we put that into our mission as an organization, that not only would the CIOs be coming into our meetings, but they could bring a protege or mentee into those discussions and be treated as peers so that they could learn as much as they could from one another. And also, the discussions were in a sense, intimate in that we could talk about lots of things without it getting back to campus, to other parts of the university, thinking that this is what the CIO was truly thinking. It was a place where we could brainstorm, get ideas from other people that may not ever come to fruition, but at least allow us that discussion. And that's part of the learning curve. What we used to talk about and still do is that what goes on in our meetings stays here within the meetings unless you decide you want to share it with somebody else. So that allowed the freedom to be able to ask questions and respond to questions without worrying that it might go to a vendor or to somebody else who would all of a sudden hit your leadership with questions about what to sell you next.
Right.
So that's kind of the historical perspective. And in the process, what we have found over the last 15 years is we've had more than 20 members who have been proteges or mentees who have gone on to the role of CIO. In fact, right now, about 10% of our membership were proteges at other institutions or at their own in one case before becoming the CIO. So that's kind of a backdrop to my experience through the years. I think that it's absolutely essential that we always prepare the next generation of leaders. When I come into a role, whether it's as a CIO or whether it's a dean or whatever, I always look for who can I mentor that would be able to take my place if I were run over by a Mack truck, as we used to call it. And I think that's a key part to any management stream. The interesting thing, though, JP, is that we have done surveys in the leadership board with the Chronicle and by ourselves over the last 12, 14 years. And we asked the question about how succession planning is being dealt with on campus. And by and large, most CIOs, over 80%, and this is a survey of over 1,000 CIOs globally, that more than 80% would say that they do think that's important and are preparing someone to take on an advanced leadership role within the organization as time goes by. The problem, though, that we found in the last 10, 15 years is also that many institutions, to try to get diverse thoughts into their institution, we had more than 40% of the CIOs said that within their own institution, the executive leadership would not accept one of those people for a candidacy for their replacement. That's kind of sad because it means I'm training somebody else's CIO during the time that they're with me. Not that you need to hire them, but at least they ought to have a shot at being hired as the CIO for that institution. So it's an interesting field and an interesting time. I hope that more and more CIOs are taking that responsibility to heart, and I think they do. Most of the CIOs I've worked with through the years do see that as an important part of their job requirement, is to be training people and building skills within the organization.
Gotcha. Appreciate your thoughts on that. And it feels like, from what you laid out, it really kind of evolved from learning skills, learning the potential successors, learning what they need, kind of like on the job, into like moving more into a more formal approach, as opposed to, just kind of like, we'll have, Tina or Jack just you'll kind of wing it for right now and kind of learn along the way. But as opposed to like saying, hey, here's a specific track that we're kind of trying to set you on towards this. It seems like that's where things are going.
Yeah, that's part of it. And I think that, when I started, we built what the skill sets were going to need to be for the next generation. And we looked at strategic and tactical planning within the organization. We were the first ones to do that. Today, you have strong plans that are built at institutions on continuing the role of the use of technology for managing the institution. I think, though, that one thing that I've seen through the years that has changed is that there was a period of time, maybe 20 years ago, where people said, well, technology is changing so quickly, you can't really do long range planning. And there were people who thought that this was not a good idea. You always have to think out into the future, even though tactically you might not know what it will provide you as far as tools and resources to get there, but you have to have a goal out in mind. And I've long said that 20-year plans are still important, even though the technology changes. And I think when you look, Mike McRobbie was a good example at Indiana University. He became the CIO, came from a CIO's role in Australia, came to Indiana University, built their strategic long-term planning during a time when people said you couldn't do it. And he ended up being the president of Indiana University for quite a long period of time. He was able to move to the next step to execute it, which is kind of unusual. So I think that while technology changes, the role of the CIO is to always have a vision for what goes on into the future. When I was the head of higher education research at Gartner, I was on a plane one day and I was putting together my outline, my slides for presentation for the higher ed scenario for the Gartner Symposia. And there was a fellow sitting next to me, and he looked and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm creating this slide for higher education CIOs and leadership and IT for the Gartner Symposium." He says, "I know Gartner very well." And he said, "Explain your slide." And I had a Venn diagram that talked about that the CIO at this time needed to have three characteristics in the intersection of those. With the greater the intersection, the better chance of success. One was that you had to have leadership. The second was that you had to know the business of higher education. And I think those are things, and you had to have a knowledge of technology. Not that you had to be deep into a particular technology, but you had to understand technology. And I looked at him and he said, "I agree with that." He said, "I'm a headhunter for Egon Zehnder out of Switzerland, and we provide leadership like this for Fortune 500 companies, CIOs and CEOs." And I said, "Well, I always want to learn from somebody that I can. I like the idea of being a mentor, but I like to be mentored by people who have more skills and knowledge than I do." And so I said, "Well, it would be great to be in your position where you can pay well and recruit the very best into your field." Because I said in higher ed, it's very much that we get to pick 2 out of 3. Out of the 3, you may get somebody who's a good leader and who knows technology, but they don't know the business of higher ed. Or they may know the business of higher ed and be a good leader, but those are getting all 3 is very rare. And he said, "That's true for me as well." And I thought, ooh, if you can pay the salaries that you were paying and the rest, how do you get the best CIOs into those positions? And he said, without hesitation, the ones that succeed are those that have leadership, but know the business that they're in. People that move from industry to industry don't do as well as those who understand the business of the industry. And I think that's true for higher ed. As I moved along in the next few years, though, I also added a 4th circle, and probably some others would add others, but I added one that marketing. You had to be good at marketing, selling the value of IT to your organization. That's a key component. And it's one of the things that I regularly try to embed into conversations with CIOs, is to make sure that they understand that there are opportunities to advance the goodwill of the institution toward the work that the IT department is doing. And that's part of the role of the CIO as well.
I also wanted to ask, how much difference is there between the responsibilities of a CIO in the higher education space versus the commercial sectors? And is it an easy transition to kind of move back and forth? If you're in that kind of CIO role, if like maybe want to be recruited from one side to the other.
Well, at the Gartner Symposium, we would have 8,000 to 10,000 CIOs from all industries, And one of the things I would tell the higher ed CIOs is sit down at lunch or breakfast with a group of people from outside of higher ed, get ideas from them and share your ideas, because there are some things that are in common, but there are also some things that are quite different. And one of the things that I've watched is there are people who are very successful as leaders of technology in a particular business or industry, whether it's healthcare or healthcare comes closer to higher ed than some, financial services, for example, manufacturing. But when you get into higher ed, there are some differences that you have to be aware of. And some people just can't live with those differences. In higher ed, for example, we have so many committees on campuses that we usually have a committee on committees. And that's very tough for a CIO coming from a place where when the CIO makes the decision, it's uniformly invested in across the organization. In higher ed, you can have, and I tell them that you can have a committee meeting where it's 10-1 in favor of a decision, and that's considered a non-decision, that we don't go on until we get all people on board, and that can take time. And that can be very frustrating for someone who's used to being able by edict to say, this is what we're going to do, and this is the direction we're going. So higher ed has some uniqueness. Our ability to do things in finance, for example, we don't do accounting, cash accrual accounting, we do fund accounting. And our fund accounting rules are completely different than other nonprofit fund accounting rules. So you have to be able to transition into that. And when it comes to HR, which is a key element to any manager as well, we have a whole lot more rules and regulations that we have to follow on campus to hire people and bring them in and retain them than somebody in some of the other sectors do. So, the ability of people to come in from other industries into higher ed, it's there. And we've had some that have succeeded quite well. But on the other hand, we've had an awful lot that come in and a year or two later, they're gone. They're back to another industry because it's just too difficult to wade into some of the campus political scene that we have to deal with.
Gotcha. Are there particular skill sets that are common among CIOs, regardless of, for higher ed or the commercial space? And are these types of skills that they might, pick up like early on in their careers or maybe from college? I'm trying to get at the, what should, if somebody thinks like, hey, one day I might want to become a CIO, what do I need to start, like, kind of like, what books do I need to start looking at? Which lectures or what have you, what TED Talks do I need to pay attention to?
Well, in fact, that's a great question, JP, because people have asked me, is there something I can do to prepare?
Mhm.
And there are a lot of things you can do, but I would still say that there's people who are really good at listening and communicating well with other people and understanding their needs and their issues. That's a skill you can't really teach. It's some people do have programs to try to build those skills up, and I think you can do that. But there's some people who just cannot cut through that particular part of the role of the CIO, or for that matter, a CXO at other levels has the same issue. How do you become a leader in that field if you're not good at listening and trying to understand the needs and services that need to be provided across your organization? So, I think there are things that you can do, and of course the EDUCAUSE management institutes provide some resources to do that. But there's some people that just innately do those things, and those are the people that you want to encourage. And that's why mentorship programs, and in fact, I had a discussion earlier this morning at a breakfast meeting about mentorship programs with somebody from the nuclear energy space. And we talked about training next generation of people. And I said, you need to have 3 relationships in your career at any point in time, your peer-to-peer group, so that you can let your hair down, talk one-to-one, and they'll understand what you're saying and the rest. But you also need to look for opportunities to be mentored or to serve under somebody that can teach you something that you don't know. And then I said the third part is, if you have had the opportunity to be mentored, then you also have a responsibility to be a mentor. But I said those mentor-mentee relationships are not so much formal as they're informal. It's a relationship. And I think that that's really crucial to remember, is that you can put programs together to try to force it, 1 hour a week you're going to spend with somebody at this level. It's not that it's necessarily bad, but the best relationship building programs start with the people first and work from there. And I think most of us that have been in a leadership role, they find somebody that just intrigues them and they say, hey, this person has the skills to move up, and you begin to build that relationship and provide time to spend with them on which is what happened to me. I was very fortunate through the years to have people who took time to say, hey, here's something in this guy, we're going to try to build those skills up. And I've had not only technology leaders but presidents of universities who put me under wing and taught me so much, and I hope I'm able to pass that on to others.
How has the CIO role changed or evolved in the higher education sector? And what kinds of changes do CIOs kind of want to see, not only within their careers or potentially within the organizations that they're serving?
Well, I think that one of the things that has changed so significantly is that when we started, technology wasn't that deep. It was this deep, and now it's so deep that it's really difficult to keep on top of that. So the real key to success is to have key people around you that can understand the depth of particular technologies and in essence keep you informed on what's going on so that you can stay on top of that to move to the level that a CIO has to deal with CXOs and boards of trustees, to be able to take what is in many cases a technical skill and bring it down to the level of people who are not technical being able to understand what you're talking about. You can't talk over their heads. You have to relate to what their needs are and where they're coming from and be able to try to provide that for people. So I would say that you have a lot more work today than we did 30, 40 years ago to deal with preparing people to interface with people outside of the IT community to understand what you're dealing with. And of course, today you've got stuff like AI, it gets all of the press. But what does it truly mean, and where are we going to invest in it on campus? That's a different set of issues. And where may we not spend a lot of time and money on AI in particular areas? And so I think those are the kinds of things that a CIO has to deal with today. That is it's more complex technology. How do you build interfaces or bridges between not only technology and application suites, but between the people who are going to be responsible for using those application suites to advance the institution's mission?
Gotcha. And what kind of advice would you have for those who are either potentially mentoring future successors as CIOs, and those again who are looking at the possibility of maybe that's where they'd like to steer their career?
Well, one of the things that I've long talked about with young people coming into the profession is to expand your base of knowledge. So, for example, when I came in, as I mentioned, our generation, we brought technology across the institution. So we learned all about the various components of higher education through the work that we did to bring technology into those. Many people in leadership roles in technology became very proficient in a particular siloed application suite area. So, for example, the leader of technology for the financial services area or for academic support. And so, one of the things I encourage young people to do that are in that role is to go outside of the boundaries of their normal relationship and learning experiences. In essence, go in and see if you can volunteer for a committee position in an area outside of your normal sphere of influence. So if you're, for example, working with financial services people, see if you can get on a committee to support something in the academic side so that you begin to look at that broader picture, which is more difficult today than it was when we came in because the technology is more complex and you have more siloed responsibilities than what we had at the time we came in. We had to cut across all boundaries. And so that's a way that I think you can do that is volunteer, get involved in things outside of your normal workload.
Right. Michael, I appreciate your perspective on this. Thank you so much. You've been very informative and definitely give us some good insight on looking at the idea of how CIOs can prepare their potential successors. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.